Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you very much for joining the first of these webinars on proposed headline indicators for the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, which are being presented by the United Nations Environment Programme, World Conservation Monitoring Centre, UNEP-WCMC, and the Secretariat to the Convention on Biological Diversity. My name is Philip Bubb, and I am going to be chairing the session. And before I go further, I would just like to quickly cover some housekeeping. So we would like to notify you that today's session will be recorded and made available on YouTube. And your microphone will be muted and your camera will be off during the webinar. If you'd like to comment or ask a question, please type it in the question and answer section in Zoom. If your question is to a particular speaker, please include the name, and then we'll get back to you for that. And if you have any technical issues, please send a direct message to technical support, Laura Mack, via the chat. Can I have the next slide, please? So, this is the first of 4 webinars, and our aim is to introduce the metadata for the headlines indicators proposed in the first draft of the monitoring framework for the post-20 Global Biodiversity Framework. By metadata, we just mean the data that describes the indicators. It's like data about data. And we will have presentations by the organizations that provide or are developing the proposed headline indicators in the draft monitoring framework. Next, please. So we have 4 webinars, 1 today, 3 next week. And our aim is to help CBD parties and other actors understand the proposed headline indicators, what they measure, how they're in relation to the proposed goals and targets, their methods and data sources, potential national level use, their availability, whether they're ready now or being developed still, who produces the indicator. Please note that not all the headline indicators will be presented due to some limited availability of speakers, and also because some of the indicators are still at the conceptual stage. And we'd like to make clear that this webinar is to provide information to help everybody understand the indicators, is to support the upcoming negotiations on the monitoring framework, and but this isn't a negotiation meeting, of course. It's just to help people have more information and understanding so that for the upcoming discussions. Next, please. So on the pathway to COP15, we're this first dot here on this graphic where we're presenting and giving questions and answers on the information about the proposed headline indicators. With this, we'll also be presenting an information document for Substar 24 on this information, on the metadata, which we'll be introducing in a minute. And that will feed then into the discussions on the monitoring framework of Substar 24 in Geneva in March, later on. And then there will also be, in April, a technical indicator meeting to discuss the suitability and availability of indicators. And from that and other sources, there will be background papers developed on the indicators and the monitoring framework to feed into COP15. Next, please. So the information we're presenting today and the information document on metadata does not actually cover an analysis of the suitability of the indicators for measuring progress towards the goals and targets. That will come later from the peer review process of the metadata and discussions at Substar 24, and also then continued in the expert meeting in April and that will then all feed into the information document for COP15 that comes out of that. Next, please. So just to introduce our program for today, we have a 90-minute session. After introduction in a minute, I'm going to invite the Substar chair, Isidro Benitez, to give an introduction to the monitoring framework and how it relates to in the negotiation process. Then my colleague, Natasha Ali, will be giving an overview of the headline indicators, metadata, and peer review process that UNEP-WCMC have been conducting. And then we will have presentations on these 5 indicators, concluding with a question and answer session, about 15 minutes. So please do post your questions in the Q&A function. And then we're very happy to have about 5 minutes of closing remarks from the Open-Ended Working Group co-chairs. Today it'll be Basil van Haar. Next slide, please. So each presentation on the headline indicators will be about 6-8 minutes. If there's time after them, I might take 1 or 2 questions on that. But during the presentations, please do use the Q&A question and answer function. Then at the end, as I say, we'll have a longer 15-minute session on question and answers. If you also have questions, queries that you want to make directly to the indicator providers after the webinar, you can do that directly to them, or you could use this email address, UNEP-WCMC helpdesk, and we can facilitate passing those on. And just to remind you, these webinars are being recorded and will be available on YouTube, where translation to other languages is available. Thank you. Next slide. So I would now like to invite Isidro Benitez to give us a 5-7 minutes introduction to the negotiations on the Global Biodiversity Framework and the monitoring framework. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I know that many of you online are familiar with the status of Substar negotiations on the monitoring framework, and thus I will try to keep this brief. Additionally, as noted by Philip from WCMC, we're planning a series of technical webinars in order to provide a summary of specific indicators from a technical perspective. I will be providing similar remarks in all of these webinars, as the participation may change from one workshop to the next. Thus, I apologize in advance for the duplication of information of those of you who are attending multiple webinars. These webinars are being organized to support information sharing around the monitoring framework for the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. A draft monitoring framework was prepared prior to part 1 of the 24 million Substar as CBD Substar 24.3 Act 1, and an updated version of this document is currently online as non-paper for Substar 24 Part 2. This non-paper will serve as the starting point for the negotiations that we will have on the monitoring framework in the upcoming weeks. All of the indicators presented in this webinar are currently included as headline indicators in the draft monitoring framework. I've been working with the Secretariat and also with UNEP-WCMC to ensure that parties have information on the technical specificities to existing indicators methodologies. These webinars are presenting indicators which are already at an advanced stage of development. For the indicators that are not as such an advanced stage in development, these will need to be developed further if they are maintained in the monitoring framework. But a technical presentation such as the one today is not possible for these indicators. Additionally, the selection of which indicators are being presented on different days has been largely based on the availability of different global experts. I would like to thank to all the experts who have agreed to present these indicators, and I apologize to participants that were not able to group the indicators by goal or target due the ability of the experts. In terms of how these webinars relate to the upcoming SubStat meetings, during the upcoming SubStat meeting, I will reestablish a contact group on the monitoring framework, chaired by Andy Stotts of the UK and Alfred Otengiwap of Ghana. This group will be expected to assess the suitability of specific headline indicators vis-a-vis the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, including the national and global applicability of these indicators. I hope that this webinar will provide information which can inform the discussion in terms of the indicators that are being presented today. I don't want to take up too much of your time, as I know we have a busy agenda today. Then thank you to WCMC and the Secretariat for supporting the development of this webinar, and to all of you for joining us today. Good luck.
Thank you very much, Ezekiel. Very good. So next, I would like to invite Natasha Ali. Next slide, please. So Natasha will give us an introduction to the metadata for the proposed indicators in the monitoring framework and the information that is being prepared for the information document on that. Thank you, Natasha.
Thanks, Philip. Hello, everyone. So I'll go straight in with, thanks, Laura. I'll go straight in with what we have prepared in terms of an information document. So as Ezekiel and Philip have already highlighted, the organisations who are responsible for providing or indeed developing the proposed headline indicators in the first draft monitoring framework have been collating these metadata sheets which contain information about the indicators proposed, and they've been using a standardised format template, which is loosely based on that of the template used to gather information for the indicators used to measure progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals. Next slide, please. But slightly different, because the purpose of this exercise is to create as much information, generate as much information as possible to inform the process for developing the post-2020 framework and to aid the selection of those indicators proposed. So I just wanted to remind people that there are some selection criteria for those indicators in the monitoring framework, and it is proposed in the document SubStat 24/3add1, and also in the information document 16 to SubStat 24. And also just a reminder of what those proposed criteria involve, because it relates to the metadata that's being presented today. So one suggestion is that the data and the metadata related to that indicator or the indicator should or will be publicly available, that the methodology for generating the indicator is either published in a peer-reviewed journal or had at least gone through some sort of peer review process, and that the indicators should be regularly updated with less than 5 years between updates where appropriate, and that the indicator is already part of some mechanism for maintaining the throughput of those indicators. For example, if they're adopted for use through other MEAs and processes to measure progress to targets and goals there, or by being peer reviewed through partnerships such as the Biodiversity Indicators Partnership. Some additional criteria for headline indicators is proposed that the headline indicators should be used in national reports, or should be able to be used in national reports and support national planning processes. And also that the methodologies for those headline indicators should be agreed by parties, and that they should be calculated based on national data or be validated by parties. Next slide, please. So as I say, we've collated this information and we've done some very preliminary analysis on what's been provided by all of the producers of those metadata sheets. And I wanted to highlight this because it relates to that selection criteria in the process for developing the monitoring framework. So far, we've collated 26 of the proposed headline indicators of the 39 indicators, and we've collated this into an information document which is going to be made available to you for peer review. I note that 1/3 of those proposed headline indicators are either at the very early stages of development or at a conceptual stage. And what that means is it's not possible at this stage to provide thorough information on who's going to generate the indicator and how frequently will the data be updated, what format, and indeed what the indicator is going to look like. So at this point, what we've provided is a sort of reduced metadata sheet, which provides the direction of travel. So what is proposed for that indicator and how might it be generated is provided so that parties can review that information. But just to summarise where we're at in terms of those proposed headline indicators and their availability, around 40% are going to be available for use. And so at adoption of the post-2020 framework, if they are selected, they will be ready for use. Around 20% are in the development phase and are likely to be ready within the next 2 years after adoption of the framework. But then that 30%, as I say, are in that point of needing further development and with no knowledge of the timeline to develop those indicators and indeed what is going to be required to develop those indicators. In the box to the side there, we've presented the indicators that are available now, those that are in that development phase and those that are requiring some additional work. And perhaps the numbers there are not so meaningful, but what we intended to show is that there are certain goals and targets for which there are indicators that are going to be available for use at the onset of the post-2020 framework implementation phase. But there are some for which that further work is definitely going to be needed to develop indicators. And I highlight here goal D and those latter targets, 15, 16, 19, 20 and 21. Next slide, please. The other thing we've looked at is the scale that the indicator provides a snapshot of in terms of progress. So we've looked at whether the indicator is a global indicator and provides data at the global scale, or if it can be collated from data that is gathered at the national level, either through government bodies or national non-state actors. And importantly, whether or not there is a methodology for the indicator that can be adopted for use at the national level. I note that these criteria aren't discrete, so something can be a global indicator, but also be collated at the national level and have a national methodology that's available. But roughly around 16 to 18 of these indicators fall into this category. Next slide, please. The other thing we looked at in relation to those proposed criteria are whether or not the indicators are adopted for use for other MEAs and processes. And in that regard, I can report that 15 of the indicators are reported to be adopted for measuring progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals. 5 have been used in assessment reports for IPBES, and 2 were cited in the Strategic Plan for Migratory Species under CMS. 5 are peer-reviewed by the Biodiversity Indicators Partnership. What we haven't done is have a look at the whether or not the indicators that are proposed for these processes, how frequently they are actually used for those processes. And we haven't in this round provided analysis on, importantly, how frequently these proposed indicators are used for national reporting. Colleagues in NatureServe have taken a limited assessment of a selection of countries that used and looked at their 5th and 6th national reports to see how often indicators were used. So that is also available as a resource for parties in this selection process. Next slide, please. What we haven't looked at in this assessment this time around is how suitable the indicators are in relation to the corresponding goals and targets. So we haven't looked at the rationale for that indicator and whether or not it is a good measure of progress towards the corresponding goal or target. We haven't looked at the methodology to see if it can be replicated or how it is calculated, whether or not it can be calculated at the national level. We haven't looked at the specifics of what data is collected, who needs to collect that data and how that's done and what capacity is required to collate it. We haven't looked at the suitability of the actual indicator output and how accessible that is going to be for use for national reporting. We haven't looked at if something is said to be a global indicator. We haven't looked at that geographical range in any detail to see if some areas of the world are better, are well covered, and areas of the world that are less so. And we haven't looked at the time series to see if the time series is a meaningful measure of the corresponding draft goal or target. Next slide, please. That's where the peer review comes into play. So as I've said, we've collated this metadata into an information document that we will shortly make available for peer review. That throughout that peer review will be open throughout the SBSTA negotiations and beyond. We will also make those metadata sheets available to the technical community through, for example, partnerships such as the BIP. And as Philip mentioned, we will then have an expert meeting, including technical partners, to look at what comes out of those discussions at SBSTA, and of course the results of the peer review of the metadata sheets, and to have a look at the availability and the suitability of what is proposed. And then arising from all of this process, we will generate an information document as an input to COP15, which looks at the outcomes from SBSTA and the discussions therein, the results of the peer review, and of course the technical partners meeting. And that we hope will better inform this process. Next slide, please. I just wanted to end with where we're gathering these resources. So in addition to the information document that we will make available on the metadata, we'll make this available on the website post-2020indicators.org. And finally, I want to just flag that the team at UNEP-WCMC is doing our best to provide as much information as we can to help with the development of the monitoring framework for the post-2020 framework. So please get in touch with us if there's further information that we can provide, and how you would like to receive that information, what formats we can do, and we'll do our best to continue to support this process. Thank you very much. Thanks, Philip.
Thank you very much, Natasha. Great, so now let's pass into the presentations on the indicators. And first, I would like to invite Dr. Katie Miette of GEO BON, of the Science Officer for GEO BON, to give us a couple of minutes of an introduction to the GEO BON indicators framework, and then we will go to two of their indicators.
Thanks very much, Philip. Thank you, everyone, and to the WCMC and also the CBD for organizing this webinar and for the opportunity for GEO BON to participate. For those who don't already know, GEO BON is an international network of scientists that seeks to improve the acquisition, coordination, and delivery of biodiversity observations. The headline indicators that Walter and Sean will be describing after me will describe today the result of tremendous effort of experts that are, and they are also considered to be essential biodiversity variables. So a fundamental tenet of an EBV is that they lie conceptually between raw data and indicators. So as you see in this figure, it's the middle strip. Essential biodiversity variables serve to harmonize biodiversity observation data and define a minimum set of measurements capable of capturing the multiple dimensions of biodiversity change. By integrating and standardizing data collected at several spatial and temporal scales, EBVs are the first abstraction of complex biodiversity information, and they act as an intermediary between primary observations and biodiversity indicators capable of informing policy. GEO BON has tested numerous variables. We screened them to meet the requirement of being sensitive to change, while also striving to be ecosystem agnostic and scalable and feasible to implement. That's a key factor. A number of indicators developed by members of GEO BON, which have been scientifically peer-reviewed, are also part of the monitoring framework as complementary indicators. So next slide, please. Just to give you some additional information, we invite you to view the metadata sheets when they do become available, made by the WCMC, particularly because the one on invasive species for indicator 6.0.1 will be made there. We also would like you to know that there is additional information on the CBD's Geneva meeting webpage. So for the Species Habitat Index, there's an information document called IMP6 that was developed by the Species Population Working Group. And also for the genetic effective population size over 500, or indicator A.0.4, there is an other document, which is under item 18. So if you go to the Geneva documents website, and the bottom left will show you the other tab, there's information there. And lastly, there is a recent other document, item 21, that GEO BON has also available that summarizes this information and provides additional indicator information. So I'll stop there and I'll pass the floor over now to Walter, who will describe the Species Habitat Index. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katie. And next slide, please. I'm speaking on behalf of a large group of members of the GEO BON community, as well as country partners and experts across the world, and about a 10-year or so effort to get us to this point today, where we have a global yet national high-resolution indicator addressing Goal A. As we know, Goal A is about ecosystem integrity and connectivity, as well as species populations and genetic diversity. And if you could move to the next slide, please. The powerful aspect of the Species Habitat Index is that it really addresses all of these components of the goal. It addresses the integrity of ecosystems through a measurement of how well ecological processes are sustained, much more than measuring purely the extent of ecosystems or their connectivity. It measures the extent and connectivity for tens and hundreds of thousands of species, habitats that make up these ecosystems. So we're looking inside the ecosystems as well as across ecosystems in terms of these assemblages and the functions and ultimately services that they're supporting. But the indicator can also be interpreted at the species level and inform about the health of species populations, and rather directly actually also about genetic diversity change. Next slide, please. The indicator is part of a new generation of indicators, as these EBV-based indicators are, that leverage the tremendous growth in situ biodiversity information, as well as, next slide, tremendous growth in remote sensing capabilities, global products, but as well as increasingly national and regional products that countries are developing, land cover products that are developed using some of these remote sensing signals coming in. And of course, with partners such as GBF and other national activities, there is tremendous growth in biodiversity records that can then be linked up to these national to global remote sensing products. Next slide. And the indicator, the Species Habitat Index, leverages this information. We're really at a completely new time now than 10, 15 years ago. We have these data sets, they're growing, we know they're continuing. We can on an annual basis, in a timely fashion, assess and reassess status and trends of biodiversity and of ecosystem integrity overall. So here, a single species example, we can in great detail assess the species habitat distribution. We can validate it with occurrence points. You see some here in the corner. The points alone or abundance measurements alone are insufficient to do this in a representative way globally. But here is where remote sensing, as well, relatively simple habitat models can help us assess these patterns and their change. So you see that this species, as well as tens of thousands of other species for which this information is in this form available and accessible and downloadable, we can see the extent as well as the connectivity of these habitats in great detail. Next slide. And we can then, through these land cover products that are repeatedly developed, in many cases, there is a great global product at 300 meters of resolution that we're using for this assessment that we can use in over 180 countries now, developed through the European Space Agency. We can use that to annually assess land cover change and habitat change, but the national products that might have been done in 2-year or 5-year products that enable that as well, and then obviously have a different interval, but they're also annual products. So this is very versatile, and the methodology can be applied nationally in a very versatile way. What we're looking at here is for the standardized product across multiple countries in this region, now the loss of habitat in high resolution for this particular species, in red, the pixels that have been lost as suitable for this species. And we can then, in the next slide, look at what that means in terms of area and indirectly population loss. This is a very powerful way of assessing how has the population size changed for this species. And we see that about 20% of change has actually happened in the suitable habitat, and indirectly, roughly also the population size for that species. And we can do so for, and this is now for one particular country, Liberia, but we can do this now for different countries as well as globally. We can also assess the stewardship, that is the portion of the global population size that the country is expected to harbor. Next slide. Alongside this, we can go beyond just area. We can actually look at the connectivity through a very well-established metric called the distance to closest edge. You can see how that has decreased as well over the last 19 years and is down about 15% for the species in this particular region. So this metric allows us to look at, okay, how much are the populations and the service and the functions that they provide compromised in being able to do that, to convey that connectivity, that integrity to the ecosystems. That's so vital. And that's interesting and wonderful for a single species, but obviously, as soon as we have that, and we have it, for example, for these countries, for hundreds and thousands of species, so between 300 and now 3,000 species per country for which this assessment has been done, we can then aggregate this up and get a compound metric of integrity. Next slide. And this is how the metric is then calculated. It's simply the average of these species level values. C is shared with a second country. You can bring in that stewardship metric as a weight in this calculation, and we're simply averaging the area and the connectivity. What we find in country 2 is that through restoration efforts, one species D has actually gained in area and connectivity. And the species habitat index is then simply the average across species as well as across the area and connectivity components. Next slide. As I said, this is a straightforward methodology that requires baseline species distributions that many countries are developing and could use. Then it requires a baseline assessment and a reassessment over time. Next slide. So this information has been developed for over 180 countries through GEO BON's activities, and the associated infrastructure is accessible there, can be subset by species and by species groups. So you might be looking at a particular functional group, say frugivore species, the thousands of frugivore species for which there is data already available. These very metrics are available, and you can subset it by ecosystem type, and you can scale this down to any subnational regional area and ultimately a square kilometer size. There are still gaps. Marine measurements are in development, so they should be out middle to end of this year for 13,000 fish species as well as marine mammals, and there are other invertebrate species coming in. So this then allows us to look at habitat changes inside coral reefs, mangrove seagrasses, and bringing human impacts. This methodology is also readily applied to freshwater, where you can then use barriers such as dams as boundaries to that connectivity measure and do the very equivalent calculation for freshwater species. And we hope to support that development over the next year. Next slide. So the really powerful aspect of the species habitat index is that it addresses all the major components of goal A. It's a primary measure for connectivity integrity, also for population size and population distributions, of course. And it also can directly assess changes in genetic diversity through an assessment of the proportion of populations maintained within the species. So it's a really powerful compound metric across the goal A components. Next slide. It's been used in a range of peer-reviewed publications, as well as in the IPBES global assessment. It's been an IPBES indicator partner for some years and been used in a range of reports. For about 15,000 species already, the data is downloadable. It can be validated by nations. It can be used, mix and match as wished. And here's some links with access and more information. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Walter. Very clear. Good. I think we'll pass next to the other GEO BON indicator with Sean Hoban on the proportion of populations within species with a genetically effective population size less than 500.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to present to you the indicator, the proportion of populations within species with a genetically effective size greater than 500. Next slide. This is the first indicator specifically designed to track genetic change in populations of wild species. It will help to measure how we manage, monitor, protect, and maintain genetic diversity. Importantly, this indicator does not require genetic data or DNA analysis. It measures a concept called the effective population size. This is a way that we can measure how fast genetic diversity is eroding without actually using DNA data. Effective size, or NE, is not a new concept. It's actually been used by the CBD and by the FAO for decades to declare an agricultural breed as genetically threatened. And it's been used in forestry and fisheries management. So we are moving this very well-established concept to wild populations. The NE, or effective size, is typically a fraction of the census size, the number of adult individuals in a population, as shown in this very simple diagram. So we can actually measure NE, effective size, from the known census size of a population. And this is the basis of this indicator. Next slide. Why a threshold of 500? We know that genetic diversity is lost very quickly in small populations, and it accelerates as the population gets smaller and smaller. And at a threshold of approximately 500, above that threshold, the great majority of genetic diversity, according to several metrics, can be maintained for several to many decades for most species, and species are better able to respond to natural selection and thus adapt to ongoing environmental change. The threshold of NE 500 can be translated to approximately a threshold of NC, or census size, 5,000, based on a ratio of NE over NC of 0.1 or 1/10, a safe threshold that has been established through a review of many studies on this concept. Next slide. So the methodology is straightforward. It is to gather and compile existing census size, or NC, estimates from populations within species. Then this is converted to NE, or effective size, using the threshold, the ratio just mentioned of 0.1. And then that NE is compared to the threshold of 500, and we count the number of populations per species above that threshold, and then take average across different taxonomic groups. So each country, we foresee compiling this indicator for tens to perhaps hundreds of species per country, not for all species within a country, just a representative set of countries, because we recognize that although biodiversity data is increasing globally, we still lack census size level information for most species at the population level, and guidance is being developed on how to choose the precise species for which data is most likely to be available and to be representative of all species in the country. What kinds of data sources? These would be country level species management plans, national biodiversity databases, national or global red list assessments, or consultation of experts. Next slide. So I'll give you two short examples. This is a management plan for threatened plant species in which the population sizes, actually at each location, have been compiled. We can look at what's called a meta-population or a distinct population, withdraw or compile those NC, or census size, estimates shown in the blue box. We compare that to our threshold of NC of 5,000, again, which translates to our NE of 500. 2 of the 5 populations, or 20%, are above that threshold. So that would be our indicator for this species. Next slide. This is actually from a red list report. Not all red lists have population level information, but many of them do. So this is a tree in which the census size has been recorded, and both of them are under the threshold of 5,000. If there are questions later, I can talk about using different thresholds for trees versus mammals versus birds, and translating this in different ways. Next slide. So how far is this indicator for development? Recently, we have trialed this indicator in partnership with the Sweden biodiversity agencies. And we examined thousands of species red list assessments to see how much data was available. We did a deep dive into several vertebrate groups and actually calculated the indicator for those groups. And that has recently been put as an open access article on the internet there. And right now we are starting trialing this indicator with numerous other countries. And if you're interested to join this effort, please get in touch with me or my colleagues. For more information, there's a webinar. And yes, we're developing this guidance document. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, here. So this guidance document we're developing, we should have a first draft of this guidance document of how to choose species and then how to calculate this indicator step by step, lots of detail by this summer. And by the end of the year, we'll revise this document based on our trial with the countries that we're working with to trial and improve the methodology. We don't have an online and don't envision an online calculator at present. We think the indicator calculations will work best working with national level biodiversity experts and national level data. But in the future, there is potential for developing a sort of online dashboard, such as what Walter presented. And it's a highly scalable indicator that can be calculated, again, using different species at different scales. Next slide. There are numerous publications where you can read more. Most of these are open access, so these are peer reviewed. There are gaps that are similar to many biodiversity indicators, such as not having data on insects and other gaps. It is disaggregatable at the country or regional level. So I just want to close by saying that this indicator will be a valuable way to measure genetic diversity change, as well as the protection of genetic diversity and maintenance of it. But it should be complemented by indicators on maintaining distinct populations, preventing population loss, managing appropriate genetic exchange among populations, and genetic monitoring. But this will be our headline indicator, again, on the effective size greater than 500 for maintaining genetic diversity within populations. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Katie, Walter, and Sean. Very informative. We haven't quite got time for questions, so we'll move on to the next speaker, please, who is Dr. Alexandra Zimmerman, Chair of the IUCN Species Survival Commission's Human-Wildlife Conflict Task Force. And she will be introducing to us the proposed headline indicator, proportion of species populations that are affected by human-wildlife conflict.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And thanks also for the invitation to speak briefly about this here. So the very first thing to clarify on this particular indicator is that this is a very early stage development one. Like Natasha said at the beginning, some of these are in concept and development stage. So much so that actually the wording on the text is not at all that's not actually the indicator as it stands at the moment. So I want to just talk briefly about the conceptual background to how this is being developed. Next slide, please. So I think it's really important just to give a little bit of context, especially for those who don't work with human-wildlife conflict regularly. This is extremely important because it very much shapes how this indicator is going to take shape. Basically, what you have is a strongly emerging, increasingly global conservation challenge that is both a challenge for biodiversity and for sustainable development. It occurs in pretty much every country, and some countries are grappling with this to huge extents. What is interesting about this issue is that it presents itself as a clash between wildlife and people, and that is what brings it out as an issue. What it is really about is actually conflicts between different groups of people about how to handle wildlife, whether to live with wildlife, and how that coexistence that we're striving for should take shape. Now, this isn't so much intellectual pedantic detail. This is fundamental. This has to shape how the indicator is developed, because basically if we don't understand that these are really about human-human conflicts between groups of people, then we will go down the wrong path with this indicator. Next slide, please. So just to put that a little bit more into further context of what does it then mean for measuring and monitoring this. In human-wildlife conflict, we always have these two axes. We basically have that interaction between a species or multiple species and communities, and we have these conflicts, tensions between different groups of people. Now, if you look, and those two axes are always present, so we can't look at one or the other. It has to be both for this indicator. So if we look at just the interaction between wildlife and people, there you can already see that there are quantifiable things that can be measured. You can look at extent of damage, injuries, retaliation, economics, and so on. So that's in a way the easier part of it. The harder part, but it is absolutely essential to be part of the indicator, is that we figure out how to also track and measure conflict between people. And this is much more qualitative in nature. This is about relationships and history and social tensions and good process of engagement and all sorts of things. So that's where it gets tricky. To measure only one or the other, as I said, would be detrimental. It can even make conflict worse. So we have to look at both. Next slide, please. And so where it gets really tricky, as with many of these, so it's always the devil in the detail. Once you start to think about what are the metrics going to be, there's basically three major challenges here. One is that what scale are we going to try and measure this at? And of course, all the other targets and indicators are struggling with this too. The other is how to capture the complexity of these multifaceted issues. And the third is how to adapt a methodology that is relevant and feasible to situations that are vastly different from each other. Even within one country, parties will be dealing with very, very different scenarios. Next slide, please. So where we are now is that in the current text, under target 4, we have the sentence or the add-on that says it's about effectively managing human-wildlife interactions and avoiding and reducing human-wildlife conflict. Next slide, please. Just very quickly, the history of this is that the topic of human-wildlife conflicts, first time this is in the CBD text, which is and so far all the parties, pretty much all the parties are saying that it is an important issue. It needs to feature somewhere. It's evolved a little bit in wording. So where we are now is in the first draft, as I've shown there. That's in the middle of this slide. But just again, for background, there is ongoing discussion currently still about where exactly this item should sit in the whole framework text, because it is both a species issue and a human issue. And so it's been, there's been debate between target 4, target 9, and even some suggestions of a separate target entirely, because it's so unique in nature. So this continues. Next slide, please. Now, what you've seen there on the agenda, and as this was introduced, is currently it says that the indicator is a proportion of species populations that are affected by human-wildlife conflict. This is outdated. This is incorrect. None of the various organizations working on this are happy with this particular. So this needs to be struck out. We're working on something different. Basically, where this came from, it's old text where there was too much, and the first line of that was taken as a placeholder. So think of this as a placeholder, but next slide will continue on where we need to go with it. So we kind of wanted to put principles first and then figure out the details. The principles here are that we've got to incorporate qualitative measures somehow. We've got to figure out how to make the indicator look at really how it can help drive change and improve impact, and particularly focus on process, because this is core to achieving human-wildlife conflict. So next slide. In the Human-Wildlife Conflict Task Force of IUCN, we've got a little info doc on what are just the fundamental considerations for developing indicators. And I'll refrain from reading this out word for word, but briefly, it's really to figure out, to measure what matters. So keeping in mind the long-term aim of actually resolving conflict, focusing on process, including the human dimension heavily, making it adaptable to context and also feasible, because measuring human wildlife conflicts can be enormously logistically difficult. Next slide, please. So where we are right now, and this is work in progress. So several organizations across 2 task forces of the IUCN, that includes, our task force includes WWF and several other organizations currently working together to try and refine this further. So definitely this is at conceptual development stage. And so we are looking at how can we have an indicator that shows trends in improvement of getting to the goal of coexistence. And that probably will include several components. At the moment, and this is work in progress, it's probably going to include elements of tracking incidences or impacts. Those are the quantifiable ones. It will contain an element of interpreting the human side, the tolerance for wildlife, willingness to coexist, and an element of quality of process, of engagement, of dealing with conflict resolution. The details of that are being worked out in our in our collaborations right now. There's different suggestions that we're all exploring right now, including, for example, an index, which would measure these components and try and quantify them as much as possible. And then there's also ideas around a more self-reporting tool where parties would be given guidelines, such as the IUCN guidelines on human-wildlife conflict, and then need to demonstrate progress towards those aims and principles. Next slide. I think that's it from me then. And here's just a website where more of that information is found. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. A very clear demonstration of the challenges in developing new indicators for important subjects. Thank you. I'd like to pass then next to our next speaker, Katia Kalifakis, who will be introducing the proposed headline indicator, value of subsidies and other incentives harmful to biodiversity that are redirected, repurposed, or eliminated. Thank you, Katia.
Thank you very much, Philip, and thank you very much to CBD and UNEP-WCMC for the invitation to present on this. I'll say from the very outset, which you can also see from this slide, I will not be presenting on the harmful incentives, including subsidies, where OECD is a provider of data on this issue because on the agricultural support, because it does not meet the headline indicator criteria. And I'll go back to that at the very end of this presentation. But what I will be presenting on is an indicator for Target 18, namely on the positive incentives for biodiversity conservation and sustainable use. Next slide, please. And Giorgio, also from the OECD, from the Development Cooperation Directorate, will be presenting afterwards on Target 19 on the ODA data. So I'm just briefly going to highlight here, as we were asked to provide an introduction to the indicator producer, which is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. We provide evidence-based policy analysis, collect data from OECD and non-OECD countries, validate the data and provide it for public policy use. And we provide a platform for exchange and for the sharing of best practices, hoping in the context of environment to provide more environmentally effective and cost-effective policies for environmental protection. Structurally, we have a number of directorates. I'm in the Environment Directorate, working on biodiversity. As I said, number of other directorates, Development Cooperation, Trade and Agriculture, etc. And we work with multiple committees and working parties, so our country delegates, on various issues such as our Environmental Policy Committee, the Development Assistance Committee, and many, many more. Next slide, please. So, but coming to target 18 and on the issue of the positive incentives for biodiversity, as many may already know, under HE target 3, there was the language there to develop and apply positive incentives for biodiversity conservation and sustainable use. And our OECD data on positive incentives has been used for under the Biodiversity Indicators Partnership, so it's already peer-reviewed. Under proposed target 18, there is reference also to positive incentives. And I'll highlight a bit more various aspects of that. But just to say that for now, other non-incentive-based policy instruments are covered in a number of other of the post-2020 targets. And I'll explain what I mean by that. But they include, for example, protected areas, land and sea use spatial planning, which are not incentive-based mechanisms. And also the data we have on positive incentives links to SDG target 15A, which is to mobilize and significantly increase financial resources from all sources for biodiversity, covering also the revenue generated and finance mobilized by economic instruments, which are the positive incentives, to which we provide data for that. So for SDG indicator 15A1. Next slide. So we call them economic instruments, the positive incentives. Economic instruments are also referred to as incentive-based instruments. They're also called market-based instruments, in contrast to another category of policy instruments, which are referred to as regulatory or command and control instruments. And those types of instruments are things like standards, restrictions on use, such as protected areas, etc. Economic instruments or positive incentives are a type of policy instrument, a suite of policy instruments that provide continuous incentives to both producers and consumers to behave in a more environmentally sustainable way. And they have efficiency properties, they allow flexibility so that producers and consumers can meet environmental objectives in a more cost-effective manner as well. So they also have some other advantages. In any case, economic instruments that are relevant for biodiversity include instruments such as taxes, for example, taxes on pollution, such as pesticide taxes, fertilizer taxes. They include fees and charges, such as fees and charges that are placed on hunting and fishing licenses, entrance fees to national parks. They include the environmentally motivated subsidies, so the good ones, if you like, when governments make budgetary transfers to enhance the environment, so providing incentives again for biodiversity protection. They also include tradable permit schemes, such as individually transferable quotas for fisheries, tradable permit schemes for groundwater extraction, and many other examples. They include payments for ecosystem services. They include biodiversity offsets, and also things like fines on environmental damages, such as when there are oil spills, etc. Next slide, please. And what is the rationale for using these economic instruments or incentive-based instruments, positive incentives for biodiversity? Well, they're able to internalize the environmental externalities. So one of the underlying reasons why biodiversity is being overused and overexploited is that it exhibits a number of public good characteristics, which means that the costs and in some cases the benefits are not reflected in our everyday market prices. So we're overusing them. Essentially, they're being used as if they're free. And so what these positive incentives or economic instruments can do is that they can integrate the values of biodiversity in policies by raising the prices, for example, through a tax or through a fee charge, to reflect the true values of biodiversity in everyday decision-making. So the use of these instruments, when they're applied by governments, are also relevant to Target 14. As I mentioned before, they're able to achieve environmental objectives at a lower total economic cost than other more traditional command and control approaches for environmental protection. They can be applied to address environmental and biodiversity issues across a range of sectors. So they help to mainstream biodiversity across sectors such as agriculture, forestry, fisheries, tourism, infrastructure, and many, many more. And they're also able to generate revenue or mobilize finance. And hence, as a result, they're also relevant to Target 19, which is on resource mobilization. And I'll go into that a little bit in a moment again. Next slide. So at the OECD, since the 1980s, so more than 40 years ago, we've been collecting this data. It's readily available. We have a database. It's called Policy Instruments for the Environment. And this database collects quantitative and qualitative information on the type of policy instrument that is relevant for the environment. And we cover 6 instruments in total. The year that it was introduced, so what year, was it 1980 was it introduced? Was it introduced in 2010? Was it introduced a lot before that? The environmental domain that it's relevant to, and we have a number of environmental domains, including biodiversity. So when the network of contacts provide information, they can tag the policy instrument by the domain that it's relevant to, what industries it's related to. So we could also do analysis to see which sectors and industries are related, to see where mainstreaming is occurring most. The types of revenue that is generated, the costs or the rates of how these instruments are applied, which gives you an indication of the ambition, how ambitious these instruments are.
Hello, Katja. Sorry.
Yeah.
Could you just move on a little more, just so that we have time for questions and answers?
Sure. So more than 120 countries are now contributing to the PINE database, and it's reported in a consistent and comparable way across countries. Next slide, please. So we have information here on the methodology, on the sources, etc. It's updated annually. The data is provided by a network of more than 200 country experts, and the OECD Secretariat, in consultation with the countries, then validates the data before it's all published and available online. Next slide, please. And as of a few years ago, we've been, there's a picture missing there also with the 2021 update, but we've been extracting and analyzing the biodiversity relevant data from the PINE database, given its relevance to CBD and SDG 15. And I'm sorry, the 2021 update is not showing there. But also in 2021, we included, we conducted questionnaires on peasant biodiversity offsets to obtain information on those 2 additional types of economic instruments. Next slide. There it is. Okay. Next slide, please. So here you see, if you could click twice, just so the full information is there. The number of countries we have here with biodiversity relevant economic instruments over time, and you see them for taxes, fees and charges, etc. Also, perhaps interesting to note that since 2010, when we had Aichi Target 3, there hasn't actually been that much progress in the uptake of these instruments. Next click, please. Just an indication here of the revenue mobilized, for example, from biodiversity relevant taxes, it's around 9 billion a year. But that's only less than 1% of all revenue mobilized by environmentally relevant taxes. Next click, please. And next slide. Here you see the total number of economic instruments. So over time, by the type of instrument. Next slide, please. It is also, the data is available, of course, also by country. So you can see here the types of instruments applied in the various countries. Next slide, please. And we're now conducting a pilot in 5 countries to start collecting data through the PINE database on payments for ecosystem services and biodiversity offsets. The pilot will last about 1 month, and the PINE database with these 2 additional instruments will be deployed in April 2022. Next slide. And so just to finalize, with regard to the data that was proposed in this document, add 1 from the CBD on potentially most environmentally harmful support to agriculture, it does not meet the headline indicator criteria. We did not disaggregate the data by country, but if it's of interest, the data could of course be used as a complementary indicator in the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. Next slide, please. Thank you very much. And here we have the information with the links, etc. Thanks very much.
Great, thank you, Katia. Good, so we'll go next to our last presentation by Giorgio Gualberti on official development assistance for biodiversity.
Thank you very much, Chair, distinguished guest, for the opportunity to speak to you about this indicator on official development assistance for biodiversity. This is, as Katia was saying, presented by the OECD, and in particularly the data is collected by the Development Assistance Committee, that is a committee which is of the 30 largest provider of development finance, which is active since 1960s. So next slide, please. So what is, this is about the content of our presentation, which is organized around 7 questions. First is, what is the official development assistance? How ODA targets, how we track the targeting of the Convention on Biological Diversity? What is the scoring system? How we can access and visualize the data, and what are the linkages with the SDGs latest trends? And finally, how can we get more information? So let's go directly to the next slide, please. So what is official development assistance? The point here is about these 3 words: official, development, and assistance. Official means that these are financing flows that are provided by official agencies, so governmental agencies, state and local governments, or anyway, state-controlled institutions. Development, this means that all these flows are administered with the promotion of economic development and welfare of developing countries. This should be the main objective of the flow. So a flow that is of mutual interest is not part of ODA. A commercial flow is not part of ODA. And assistance, this means that these flows can be either grants or loans, but if they are loans, they are concessional in character. It means that they should have some conditions that are below market rates, and there is a calculation to do so, and there are some kind of grant elements that applies to different country groupings that define if there is if this loan is concessional enough. Another point that is important is that to be official development assistance, the recipient of this grant or loan should be included in this DAC list of ODA recipient that is revised every 2 or 3 years on the basis of the income per capita and other factors. So all this was first defined in 1969, and the definition of ODA was then tightened in 1972. And the OECD, the DAC in particular, collects this data every year at the activity level with a great level of granular information. So more than 50 data fields are collected every year. And one of these fields about the official development assistance is specifically dedicated to track support to the objectives of the Convention on Biological Diversity. So next slide, please. This field, which is we were talking about, is called the Rio marker on biodiversity. So for each activities that is reported as ODA by DAC members are obliged to signal if this activity contributes to the objectives of the Convention on Biological Diversity. This is not a voluntary field. It's something they are obliged to say if this is yes, is no, and to what extent this activity contribute to the CBD. So this comes, this started around in 2000 with some survey that were dedicated to this, and is part of the integrated yearly regular data collection since 2008. And a couple of years ago, actually 4 years ago, in 2018, it was updated through a task force of international experts, also in collaboration with the CBD. So what is the definition of this Rio marker? So we say that an activity promotes the objective of the CBD if it promotes at least one of the 3 objectives of the Convention: conservation of biodiversity, sustainable use of its components, or fair and equitable sharing of the benefits of the utilization of genetic resources. Then we have a set of eligibility criteria that in a certain way put a little bit more details on the definition, and that you find it in the slide. I don't go in all the detail of this, but the point is that these are the wording of this criteria has been researched on the basis of the latest CBD meetings and decision, and its activities that are eligible only if they should at least contribute to one of these seven criteria: conservation and enhancement of ecosystem, or integration of biodiversity, elimination of phasing out of harmful incentives, and so on. Next slide, please. So once we have that an activity corresponds to this definition and eligibility criteria, we have the point of scoring. How does it work? So Rio markers are not a quantitative measure, but they are a qualitative measure that assess to what extent an activity contributes to the CBD objectives. So we can have a 3-scale scoring. That is, an activity can be considered principal. So if the objectives of this activity is so if biodiversity is fundamental in the design and impact of the activity. So if this objective of biodiversity, these activities would not have been would not have taken place without these CBD objectives. Or this biodiversity could be an important objective of the activity, but not the principal one. So the activity has been adjusted to a certain extent to also include biodiversity objectives. Or if it's 0, that means the activity has been screened, but it does not really target biodiversity, and so it should not be included in the indicator. So,
Giorgio,
yes.
Sorry, could I ask you, could you finish in 2 minutes so that we have time for questions?
Of course I can.
Thank you.
So this is the most important characteristic of the Rio marker. And we go on the next slide, please. Okay, so here we have 2 points of where you can access the data, which is the full data set on OECD.stat, and then we have a data visualization tool that is online, updated every year. And there are the links where you can download the data. And next slide. So there is a very similar indicator on the SDG framework that is target 15A. Katia also talked about this for the second part. Target 15A.1 is official development assistance on conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. And this is defined as gross disbursement of ODA for biodiversity. And this is the sum of ODA flows that has the marker as a principal or significant objective. And so this is the 15.A.1A SDG indicator. And then next slide. Then here we can show a simple data visualization on how biodiversity related development ODA is in the latest years. So this is possible visualization that you can use, and you can also find online. And we go on the next slide. That is also on the next slides are also this kind of data visualization where you distinguish between significant and principal activities for biodiversity. And next slide. That's also another visualization. This is about sectors, because there are many different possibilities to unpack this data. One is sectors, and we go on the next slide, that I think is the latest. Exactly. So here we put some links so you can have more information either on the ODA concept, on what is the marker definition and the statistical directives, on how to get access to the data, OSD.stat, and the data visualization, and on the SDG indicator, which is for which the OECD is a custodian agency. And next slide. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Giorgio. Thank you very much to all our speakers. We've just gone 5 minutes or so over what we'd hoped to have for this stage. So we've got 5 minutes or so for some questions and answers. I see in the Zoom question and answer section that we've been having some good questions and answers to specific indicators. And we have in this session a whole variety of indicators, subjects covering very different aspects and then status of development. One of the questions that's come through for more than one is about how in the post-2020 global biodiversity framework and its monitoring framework, we want indicators that help us at the global scale to measure progress and understand the targets and goals, but also equally for their use at national scale. So my question is to any of the presenters, if one or two of them would like to speak for a minute, on how can they help countries use their indicator for national level use by governments, so that they are able to be adopted by governments. And a related question to that is also, if governments want to produce their own version of the indicator, how would that relate to the global scale one? Is there somebody who would like to speak to that, as to how they could help countries have national use of their indicators? Yeah, Walter, please.
Yeah, I'm happy to speak to that, and it's a really central question, I think, for this next phase of CBD's work and reporting. I put actually partial answers to this question are in that Q&A where that particular question was already raised, and I typed down a few answers there. So for the species habitat index, and I should say generally for GEO BON's work, because it's based on EBVs that then underpin indicators that are derived from there. So these essential biodiversity variables, there is a very transparent and clear path back to the data. So and GEO BON has a whole range, has a really large network of thousands of people in countries across the world. There is an additional effort. BON in the Box is a particular initiative that is being developed right now with support from a range of funders. Regional biodiversity observation networks, thematic biodiversity observation networks to support countries, researchers in a particular region to develop these indicators independently and very directly with the regionally and thematically available data. So the methodology of these EBV supported indicators directly supports an independent national development. speaking about, and much more so than has been traditionally the case, I think, for some of the other global legacy indicator products. Speaking for the SHI for a minute, so there we've really worked hard over the years with the larger community to make sure that the data that's currently used for the global product is transparently accessible and available and downloadable. I put a link to one species example there into the chat, and that is accessible for over 15,000, almost 20,000 species right now, in a growing number. And countries can grab that, you can use that, agencies can use that, they can validate it themselves, or indeed they can just download the land cover or preference information, or indeed the occurrence information, to then independently calculate the SHI. So the methodology is very straightforward and directly usable, also completely independently with own national data and with national land cover products. As far as the comparability is concerned, and that's a really important point, Philip, right? Because ultimately, in some form, there should be something that is comparable across countries. So there we provide some guidance in the metadata sheet that WCMC is distributing. So there it'll be important that similar or the same land cover classifications are being used. For example, that some basic validation procedure is done on the species distribution information. But here we are talking about data and information that actually agencies hold, and it's a straightforward methodology that can be applied independently.
Great, thank you very much, Walter. Is there somebody else who would like to speak for a maximum of 2 minutes on the question of how to support countries use their indicators, and perhaps how to have countries' data used in global indicators? No? Okay. What I suggest then is actually, I would like to ask whether Basil van Havre, one of the co-chairs of the open-ended working group, would like to say a few remarks sort of on what you've seen from the webinar so far, where we might be going next with this, for 5 minutes or so. Thank you.
Yes. Yes, thank you, Philips, and thank you for inviting me. This has been very, very interesting presentation, and I've taken copious note, and my challenge is to keep to 5 minutes now. I wish we had more time. I would like to get behind the detail on the index proposal, and one aspect that I think all of us will be keeping an eye on is that notion of complexity, and how what technically looks like a good idea can be transformed into a doable idea on a global stage. And if Francis was there with me, I'm sure you will be keeping that in mind.
Just to say, Basil, Francis has his hand up, actually, so he's here today.
Excellent.
So
excellent.
if you could give him a chance to
that
speak as well, that would be great.
So then I won't speak for Francis because he'll do it himself. The other point is the issue of the risk we introduce by aggregating many numbers into a single index. So I don't want to sound negative. That's not my point. I think my point is more one of let's work to address those issues to make those options better. On human-wildlife conflicts, very, very interesting questions, and very happy to see that being presented and preeminent in the system. I think it's going to be very important that we do not only see that from the perspective of modified landscape, Western countries, but you look at that from the perspective of wild space, and particularly how it materialized for indigenous peoples and local communities. And perhaps some notion of capturing the severity of the interaction could be useful. So it's not the same if I'm getting pecked at the legs by a geese or on my way to hiking than somebody losing their season crop or a life or a limb. So those kind of notions should be very interesting. On economic instruments, I'm particularly pleased, and I think this is opening into discussion that we're going to need to have about financial flows and associated with particular product or service. So I think there is a lot of discussion about ecosystem service and about financial flows associated with the value of maintaining certain ecosystem, but we've not done enough, in my view, on how we're going to be flowing money back to producing a region if they're doing a good job on that. And then finally, on the presentation on ODA, in my mind, this is key. And if we take a parallel to the what is taking place on the climate side, I think a lot of the problem they encountered would have been solved if there was a good consensus around the definition and how we count ODA. So kudos to OECD for stepping into that minefields, but we will work with you to get to the other end. So those are a very quick summary of a very interesting discussion. No doubt that's exactly the kind of discussion, and I've been engaging madly into email and messaging with some of you. But Francis, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you to the organizers. I will not say so much because I think you've touched some of those areas, Co-Chair. But another area where I think you and I have converged on here is these indicators for human-wildlife conflict, because that is a field that, first of all, it is attracting a lot of debate. Where do we put it? Does it have to stand alone? Do we need it there? How best do we word it? But we know this is a reality, which is affecting conservation of biodiversity. So to see that there is an attempt here and progress made to have indicators, although it is still work in progress, I think this is encouraging, because I think the quick question to ask, how are we going to report on it even? Because if they don't know how to report on it, then they will say there is no way we can have this indicator there for human-wildlife conflict. So I think the indicator development can help us to make that case stronger. The other point I just wanted to raise is that when I reflect back, and I think Philip Barb was part of the process after the adoption of the strategic plan, which has now ended. I do recall that I think Philip Barb and the Biodiversity Indicator Partnership and with the Secretariat, they embarked on capacity building for countries at the time when they were updating and reviewing the NBSAPs on indicators. And I think this is still going to be something that will still be necessary here, because how much, for instance, would you need in terms of data collection to report on an indicator? Sometimes you can put an indicator, but you may find that the data you need to collect is so much. And so is the capacity there? Is the data itself there? So these are the other things that, in addition to the co-chair had said, I thought I could share with you, that those indicators, let's find ways of, again, making sure that those that need to be supported during when they are aligning their NBSAPs, that they understand the process very well and can do a good job in selecting the indicators at national level. And also bearing in mind that as they select, the data issue has to be looked into. I think that is just the additional part I needed to add. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francis and Basil, our co-chairs of the open-ended working group, for excellent concluding remarks. And I'd just like to thank all the presenters, the secretariat of the CBD, my colleagues at UNEP-WCMC for the really excellent, valuable information and this opportunity. And we look forward to seeing as many of you as possible next week for the other 3 webinars. And with that, I will conclude the webinar. Thank you very much.